So welcome to this presentation. Thank you all for joining us. We're going to talk today about the new FSC US standard and what that means for pesticide use. And we'll review a little bit of the implementation as well. Just a little bit on my background. I'm a forest practitioner over 18 years. In those roles, I did have experience with chemical applications in general for 7 years working for the Ryla Mill sawmill in Big Fork, Minnesota. 5 years working for one of the best land management programs in the United States, certainly in the state of Minnesota, in Aiken County Lands and Parks. In both of those, I was a certified chemical applier, and then at Aiken County, more into the management system of that. And then 15 years auditing to FSC Forest Management, also SFI, Responsible Wood in Australia. In probably the most relevant background, working on the FSC Technical Working Group during the revision of the International Generic Indicators for Risk and Use Management of Highly Hazardous Pesticides. This was a remarkable experience working with a group, an international group, with operations represented from Brazil and Scotland, social from Dr. Lane Dare out of Australia, and chemical expert, Dr. out of South Africa, Deb Muir, who was a walking encyclopedia of chemicals and their impacts on the human body. Scared the socks off of me. And in that process, those were developed, and it was truly a consensus building aspect. And that was, I think, one of the reasons I was asked to give this presentation today. An outline, we've scheduled about an hour and a half. There's only about 40 slides, but we wanted to give plenty of time for questions. We will stop throughout the presentation at various points to entertain questions. We're going to talk a little bit about the FSC US standard draft for the new version, version 2, primarily criterion 10.7. We'll look at the pesticides policy, certificate holder requirements, the environmental social risk assessments, research, prohibited chemicals, risk mitigation, repair, compensation, monitoring, and we'll look at resources, a little bit that FSC US has provided with a practical look at glyphosate specifically, and we'll briefly touch on some auditing and reporting. A bit of housekeeping, you're asked to please give your questions in the question bar, not the chat box, again, the question bar, but if someone accidentally gets it in the chat bar, we have folks ready to bring you back in. And at the very end, we'll have a very brief survey that we'll ask you to please complete. Quick words from SCS Global Services, my employer, who has granted me this time and space to develop the presentation, to share the materials I've developed while working for them. SCS Global Services started out solely in certification, verification, and auditing. And over the years, we have added different entities that are separate entities, but related to the global services, and that is consulting. More recently, SCS Standards, working on developing and giving standards for sustainability. And then most recently, we launched, I think just last week or the week before, Global Heat Reduction Initiative, a truly unique take on reducing global heat specifically, but addressing climate change. And you're welcome to go to our website and look up any of these and all the details that you would like. And I'm going to remind the moderators for our session, if there's any problems with hearing me, please let me know. So what will the new FSC US standard look like for pesticides? We're going to talk about criterion 10.7 in the new draft. I'm going to put Amy Clark-Eagle from FSC on the spot in a couple slides from now to talk about where we're at on that. But I want to dive into this first 10.7. Let's rip off the Band-Aid. Shall use integrated pest management, or IPM, and silviculture systems to avoid or aim at eliminating use of chemical pesticides. Organizations shall not use chemical pesticides that are prohibited. When pesticides are used, the organization shall prevent, mitigate, and/or repair damage, to environmental values and human health. And I want to talk about this here at the top where it says avoid or aim at eliminating. I had a bunch of people reach out to me individually a couple years ago when the new pesticides policy was released in 2019. Very upset about this. FSC wants to get rid of using herbicides, and this is actually language that has been an FSC's standard from the very beginning. So the first one that came out, I think 1997, this language is in there. And FSC has recognized very early on that there is a good and useful place for herbicides in the system, which is why they released derogations for those of us old enough to remember the awful derogations we had to use pesticides, and then eventually led to this risk-based approach, which I think is a big improvement. So anyhow, just wanted to make a quick word on that. The 10.7, I'm summarizing it in a graph because I'm visual, and I want to give you pegs where you can hang things on as we go into the details of this. Defining the problem is required by FSC. You have to identify the target or pest. You have to consider options. And this is an important bar right here. Undertake comparative assessments to select control option that demonstrates least social and environmental risk, more effectiveness, and equal or greater social and environmental benefits. That demonstrates is a key word because how do you demonstrate is you provide evidence. And so let's keep that thought in the back of our mind. The options are to avoid the problem, take no action. So when you have to consider these options, and then take remedial action or an intervention. And then if you take an intervention, whether it's non-chemical or chemical, and so the preference under FSC's framework is non-chemical, but if you choose to take a chemical option, FSC recognizes that as a legitimate and often justifiable. But if you justify it, it needs to go through the FSC framework. So if it's chemical, you have to know whether it is highly hazardous pesticide or not. And if it is a highly hazardous pesticide, whether it is restricted or highly restricted. So the risk assessment framework has a couple of different components, but the hazard category is hardwired in the system through this, whether it's restricted, highly restricted, or prohibited. Prohibited chemicals cannot be used. These are the really nasty ones. And when I said that technical working group knocked my socks off a little bit, it was learning that some of these really damaging, harmful chemicals are used in forestry in the world, not so much in the United States. So FSC system is accounting for that. And then this little arrow on the right-hand corner here, I'm looking down at this, decreasing order of preference. For FSC, restricted is preferred over highly restricted. Non-chemical preferred over chemical. And these are just the preferences. But here's the real key for that is as you do this, there's increasing FSC scrutiny, and scale, intensity, and risk come into play in FSC system, and we'll talk about that some more as well. So the normative documents and informative references, normative documents in auditing lingo just means it's required. So for the United States and forest managers in the United States that hold FSC certificates, you are required to conform to the FSC forest management standard. Current version is 1 and version 2 is coming in 2025. Again, we're going to talk about that in a couple slides. Everybody has to conform with criterion 10.7. It has integrated pest management aspects, not all chemical, everybody has to conform to that. Everybody who uses chemicals must conform, must follow the policy 30-001. There are specific clauses that I'm going to say half the document doesn't affect or require things of the certificate holders, and I'll break that down for you. And FSC policy 30-001A is the list of highly hazardous pesticides. You used to have to look everything up in it, and now all of those are generally listed in the DAR, the Digital Auditor Report. And then informative references. These are not required. These are ones I'm putting in here because I think they're relevant for some reason. So the Integrated Pest Management Guide I think this was 1998. It's been in revision, I don't know, 7, 8 years. I can't remember how long, but the principles and concepts of integrated pest management haven't changed that radically. I found it a useful reference. So if you're somebody that's never looked at it before, it might be helpful. It's up to you. And I put in FSC policy 30-001B. This is only for standard developers. This is for FSC US had to use this when they were incorporating the new indicators. I put this in here because this was a product of the technical working group. There was quite a bit of discussion about biomonitoring, and some of you may remember the early drafts of the international indicators for pesticide use included biomonitoring, which is really geared towards enclosed industries where they take blood samples and create a baseline. And FSC originally was going to include that in the new indicators. Our group argued against it. FSC US, Amy Clark Eagle and their group did a terrific job pulling together certificate holders, and INCASI in particular gave some great evidence of why we didn't need to use biomonitoring. But part of that whole conversation was that all around the world, FSC certifying bodies and auditors need to really focus on prevention. That was part of our argument, is we didn't really need to measure blood work and do baselines and do all this expensive testing if people are following safety, because most of our chemicals are herbicides that are relatively low risk, certainly compared to prohibited. So I put this in here as a reference. It's really great. It has specific PPE equipment to use with various chemicals. It's a way, if you wanted to, you could use this to raise the bar. And then 60004 are the international generic indicators that FSC US had to use in developing the new standard. Long-winded, sorry about that, and thank you for listening. So I've tried to put this all together. 10.7 applies to everybody. These are the documents, the normative requirements that impact that, defining the problem, considering the options. You can use the IPM guide. You might find that helpful. And then if you're using chemicals, pesticides policy 30-001 and 30-001A, you have to, even if you're using non-HHPs, you have to know that for sure. And then once you're using HHPs, you follow the ratings, whether they're restricted or highly restricted. If you fall into prohibited, these generally aren't used in most forestry site prep stuff in the United States. I have seen state agencies that had to use prohibited chemicals for health reasons that were ordered by the government. And for FSC system, Annex 3 of the Pesticides Policy 30-001, Annex 3, if you have to use a prohibited pesticide, and I'll go over the most important steps for that in a little bit. So I was starting to feel a little bit like this, putting all of that together. So we're going to move on. We're going to look at the draft FSC US standard. Amy, I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you, if you don't mind, to talk to us just a little bit about where we're at in the revision process. I based this, I think, on version 3, and we left it. So if you don't mind, please go ahead.
No worries. First, Beth, I want to just take a minute to recognize and thank CS Global Services for putting on this webinar. We just think this is going to be an incredible value for certificate holders and stakeholders throughout the US. So thank you very much for that. Secondly, okay, so we've been working on the revision since about 2018. We submitted a draft 3 to FSC International for their review and approval process, and that was in December of 2022. Much of 2023 and so far in 2024 has been going through a number of review cycles with FSC International staff. And I can now say that draft 4 was completed and submitted to the final decision-making body which is the International Policy and Standards Committee, the FSC International Policy and Standards Committee. And that is the body that has delegated authority from FSC's International Board of Directors for making decisions about forest stewardship standards. So we're in the very final stages of the approval process now. We anticipate that there will likely be some additional changes that will be requested by the International Policy and Standards Committee, and we'll work through that process and hopefully be able to come to a final resolution with FSC International by early 2025. We anticipate that the standard will be published on July 1 of 2025, and it will become effective, so therefore available for use on October 1st of 2025. That starts a 12-month transition period, and during that transition period, all existing certificate holders need to be audited to the revised standard. And then there's a little bit of buffer time at the end for dealing with any kind of non-conformances or additional work that needs to be done. I want to emphasize that this revision was really focused on aligning with the revised principles and criteria that are now in use around the world and with the international generic indicators. We aligned with a version of the IGIs that was just before the version that includes the work that the technical working group that Beth was with. That was published a little late in our process, so we were not able to incorporate the very final version of those IGIs. We will align with those with the next revision down the road when that comes. Our standard development group in the US focused really hard on the alignment with the pesticides policy and with the IGIs, really focusing, as Beth has said, on integrated pest management, recognizing that when there's no effective non-pesticide option available, that certificate holders are expected to use the least hazardous pesticide and use it in the least risky way. That was really the focus. And the standard development group wanted to get away from a focus on continually reducing the use of pesticides. This is a long-term goal of FSC, as Beth has mentioned, but the standard development group wanted to recognize that the use of pesticides often changes with conditions, and conditions can fluctuate. And so therefore, there are going to be times when the needs go up and down from year to year, and it's impossible to request a continuous reduction from year to year. So those were kind of the two focuses for the standard development group as they looked at pesticides for this revision. All right, I think, Beth, that was what you were hoping for, and I want to send it back to you.
Good, that is what I was hoping for. Thank you so much. So October 2025 with a 1-year transition. Okay.
Yep.
And we don't expect the pesticide stuff to change. You don't expect that to change
right.
In between.
So there were some language changes in the first couple of drafts that we went through, but the overall intent of the indicators in Criterion 10.7 have remained very consistent through all of the drafts that we've worked on here in the US. As of right now, I don't have a specific reason to think that there would be significant changes before the final approved version of the standard. But since I don't get to hold that decision, it's held by somebody else, then I cannot guarantee that.
Understood. Okay. Well, I opted to keep these in after some discussion with Amy about this, in part because I really thought these indicators captured well the certificate holder requirements from the pesticide policy. So reiterating again 10.7, which we read earlier, now it's a little more detail on that applicability, mitigation, and repair. It's going to be addressed through indicator 6.3.2. Just a summary, non-pesticides are preferred over biological pesticides. Biological pesticides are preferred over chemical pesticides. Just a quick note on that. Just a reminder, the definition, all of these are going to be within the standard itself. A couple points on the pesticide policy in 10.7. This is going to be within the draft, or was within the draft. IPM is that chemical pesticide is the best control. If you decide that chemical pesticide is the best control technique, then you must compare different chemical pesticides for best outcomes. And documentation, the red font is mine, the blue font is mine for emphasis. So just documentation, social environmental risks, and risk mitigations. And mitigations are just what are the protections that you're going to use for whatever that risk that you've identified. I really like this, the acknowledgement of catastrophic natural disturbances. We had a lot of discussions in the technical working group. Some were adamant that organizations must demonstrate it going down over time, which why it was so important that FSC US fought for us and saying that no, there are natural levels. There could be a wildfire, there could be a straight line wind in the Midwest or a tornado where you have to plant and do herbicides. So herbicide use will fluctuate. But the idea is that you have a rationale for the changes in your chemical use and you're conscious and mindful of how you're using it. So getting into the actual indicators, IPM, including silviculture systems, avoid or minimize frequency and extent and amount of chemical pesticide application, and is documented. Okay, so an IPM strategy is not static. There are expectations that if there are significant scientific breakthroughs or understandings that you can't willfully just blow it off and ignore it, that you are expected to stay up. And most forestry organizations do that. Just different things that FSC wants to have considered. So using habitat that discourages pest outbreaks or encourages natural predators. Actually evaluating the pest populations that you're doing and see if you truly need to intervene. Diversification of your species composition and structure, which is just good ecosystem health. Using low impact mechanical methods, prescribed fire, and so on. Just showing that you are considering these other aspects. There's family forest guidance, documentation of integrated pest management may be brief and less technical for family forest management units. Documentation, I made that uppercase. This is not saying you don't have to document anything. I've seen hand-drawn maps, right? Maybe brief and less technical. This is also my reminder to talk about scale, intensity, and risk. Those are really important concepts in this FSC framework. 10.72, when pesticides are used, organization demonstrates best available information, supports the most practical, effective, cost-effective, and then biological pesticides, the selected pesticide and the selected application method, timing and pattern of use, offers least risk to humans and non-target species. Applicability, some notes, you can read these on your own. That second bullet does not have to occur at the scale of individual application or site. Can be done at the FMU or Forest Management Unit level. 10.7.3, prior to using chemical pesticides, the requirements of environmental social risk assessment, the FSC ESRA framework for organizations are met before you use a chemical. And I added this FSC in this myself. This is not in the standard FSC ESRA. I just want to make a note that there is a federal ESRA that is used that is incredibly intense, levels above in different ways than what FSC requires. Peer reviews, all sorts of things that FSC doesn't necessarily require of us. So federal folks, when they saw ESRA in here, some of them flipped out a little bit. So just want to make sure you're aware of that when you talk to people outside of forestry. They may have a different idea of what ESRA is. Again, prioritizing less harmful chemicals. You have to do your risk assessment. This last bullet, for chemical pesticides, especially those that are not listed as HHPs, the safety data sheet and pesticide label together may provide much of the information needed to conduct that risk assessment. I think it's a really important point. We're going to break that down a little bit later. The whole idea here is you know what you're spraying, you know what the potential damage or hazards are, and you're protecting people, wildlife, and the environment. So let's pause here. If there are any questions, please put them into the question bar if you have them. I have another screen over here I'm looking at for questions. Transcript of the Q&A session be included with recording. I think it's going to be recorded and people can go in and look in that, and then there'll be a PDF of the actual presentation. So the transcript of the Q&A, I don't know that that will be provided. I'll let others answer that question. And we can hold on that and talk about that later. That was the only question I saw, so somebody grab me if there were more. We'll have another question stop in here in a little bit. I added this in. This is certifying body requirements. So the folks that issue certificates to the certificate holders, we have to follow our own standards. So the auditors have to follow rules for CB, or certifying bodies. And this was recently updated. The standard we have to follow is FSC standard 20-007 for forestry. And it changed from version 3 to version 4. And FSC International had a crosswalk online, and I pulled everything that relates to pesticides policies. These are the rules your auditors have to follow, okay? The first one, 1.5, shall use the pesticide policy. It's listed as new, but it's really not. There were just people who would argue about whether or not they were subject to pesticide policy. So this makes it absolutely clear everyone is expected to follow the pesticide policy for those parts that apply to certificate holders. Pre-evaluations for CBs, when you're bringing on a new certificate or a new client and you review all of the things that apply to them, which is a required element, you also have to include pesticide use requirements so that anyone new coming on under FSC is aware of this. So it's clarified, it's explicit, it's in writing. As auditors, we love that because then it's clear. During surveillance audits, 11.2, it makes it clear that the things that we have to examine and review include, changes to the forest area, management system complaints, harvesting records, also chemical use records, including records of quantitative data on pesticide use. This just makes it clear that auditors have to look at chemical use every year. 15.9, if you find a certificate holder who is using a prohibited pesticide or causing any sort of serious, significant environmental damage, they have to stop use of it immediately. Unfortunately, this was required to be made clear, so FSC has put it into the requirements for your auditors. Then 15.9, this is a part of the standard that lists all of the sampling levels, different things that auditors can use as sources or factors for their sampling, and now includes Part H, sites where chemicals have been applied or stored. So we are expected to look at chemical storage, pesticide buffer zones, and exclusion zones. And buffer zones are just like around a stream, you may have a buffer. Exclusion zones might be, let's say you have a blueberry patch and you exclude people from those where you've sprayed. Okay, so enough of that. Quick summary, short-term objectives, promote best practices is the immediate goal for protecting human health and the environment, reducing the overall volume and number of chemical pesticides. I know some people can react to that, but I don't know an organization, a forestry organization, that doesn't do that, because spraying chemicals is spraying money on the ground. So almost every forester who uses herbicides, I know, is accountable for the cost of those chemicals over time and whether they're achieving the objectives of the management organization. And then eliminating the use of the most hazardous chemical pesticides. I started in forestry 30 years ago, and this has been good for, I think, for foresters to really learn and know and understand what they're working with, which ones are dangerous and which ones aren't. I just did whatever my supervisor told me 30 years ago. So it's been a journey for me. Long-term aim, eliminate the use of chemical pesticides in FSC certified forests, and then FSC recognition that is not feasible necessarily, and FSC has demonstrated realistic expectations. So pesticide policy itself, there's a huge chunk of it that does not apply to certificate holders. Policy sections that do apply, Annex 3 for the emergency use of normally prohibited HHPs. Majority of organizations don't have to deal with that, but if you do, we'll go through that. Sections 4 through 6 and Annex 2 will cover these. So the first one from the policy that I pulled is clause 4.12.1. Non-chemical over chemical pesticides are preferred. Chemical pesticides that are not HHPs are preferred over those that are HHP. Restricted are preferred over highly restricted. The hazard categories, they're highly restricted, and prohibited, are set by FSC. Again, policy 30-001A is where you find this. I think I put in here that we had some zip file that would be available, but you can find this link online very easily, FSC 30-001A, which lists all the HHPs. Again, all of this is about risk and looking for the safest form for the most effective management. Thank you to Amy and Tom. FSC US has done a whole bunch of work figuring out where, across all the CBs, what are the most common nonconformities. So using a chemical pesticide or herbicide, however you refer to it, in a programmatic way, just getting rid of that indiscriminate use of it, where the certificate holder was not aware that a risk assessment is required for non-HHP chemical pesticides. I'll use oust as an example, which is not an HHP, not a highly hazardous pesticide. It still can have impact. And again, the responsibility and obligation of the certificate holder that chooses to use these in their program is that you know what the risks are to the people and the communities where you live and the environment and wildlife. A keynote here is it doesn't necessarily, when we say you have to know the risk and you have to do a risk assessment, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to do that big, full-blown, long, complicated Annex 2. Another common nonconformity is they did the required assessment, but they didn't adequately consider it at the site level. This includes the risk assessment not being shared with group members, contractors, or pertinent staff, and lack of prescription at the site level plan, which considers the assessment results. And the example I'll have at the site level is, and we'll look at glyphosate here in a little bit. We'll look at the US national ESRA for that, and it has mitigations. My example for that is at the individual site level, you may have a stream that runs through your harvest area, and you need a buffer for that. So you may have mitigations at the FMU level, state level, national level, but you still have to apply it at the site level with the site level prescription and records and so on. So that's really what that means. And then of course, just making sure people are aware and know what's required of them. I know it's a huge challenge when you have very large groups that are being managed. So the risk assessments must identify potential risks of damage to environment and wildlife values and human health, whether a chemical is HHP or non-HHP. I feel like I'm beating a dead horse, but I think it bears repeating. So let's talk about this risk assessment. Identify lowest risk option, conditions and use for generic mitigation and monitoring measures. So, in auditor speak, I'm looking for, you know, did you use the proper protections? Mitigation is protections, right? Monitoring is, are you keeping track of it? Scale, intensity, and risks come into play here. The more you're using, the larger your program, the more damaging the chemicals. As an auditor, that's where we're looking. Annex 2 has the minimum list of hazards, exposure elements, exposure variables. Hazards are acute, chronic, and or environmental. This is built into FSC's system through the hazard rating. Exposure elements are types of values that may be negatively affected by chemical pesticide use. And then exposure variables are conditions of the chemical pesticide use that affect the level of exposure. Additional clauses that apply to everyone who uses chemicals. You have to consult the online database for FSC pest management alternatives. There's a link for it. A lot of it's empty right now, but it's going to be built up over time and just needs to be part of your process. Generally speaking, there was a lot of discussion about this. Generally speaking, you're expected to do this. Anytime there are changes to the chemicals you're using, let's say there's a massive revision to the safety or the label, or there's some scientific understanding in its impacts or effects, then you might need to go back and consult that database again, once every certificate cycle at least. Collaboration, you're allowed to collaborate with other certificate holders. This is a really good thing. I've seen this used in other countries like Australia with industry collaboratives who started sharing at least some of the safety information, which was really beneficial for small and medium-sized companies. Control option selection, least potential for social and environmental damage, greatest effectiveness and benefits. The key part, and here's that documentation again, it gets a little difficult to accept that 40 years ago, our company did a study, but we don't have copies of the study. We don't have anybody that you can interview that was part of those studies, but this is what they concluded. Scale, intensity, and risk is going to come into there, so just be sure of what you're saying. Site operational plans, we've already talked about this. Site-specific risks and protection measures. I don't know what I did there with the animations. Increased engagement, monitoring, and mitigation with higher risks. So the bigger the risk of, let's say you're in an area that's out in the middle of nowhere with no neighbors, that's a lower risk in terms of social or community impact. However, if you're in a high residential area, then there's increased expectation of informing, getting stakeholder engagement, monitoring, and protection. Maybe you have to put up signs if there's a recreational trail. There we go. Now I'm caught up. Let me just read through this. Key points here. Again, thank you, Amy and Tom. Interpretation from September 2023, our second bullet down, national level, ESRA engagement alone is not enough. Engagement is expected at the management unit scale at your forest level. Definition of engagement is important here. Communicate, consult, and ensure participation. I'll confess I argued a little bit about this language, but this is FSC's expectation that you communicate, you consult, and you ensure participation. This is culturally appropriate, right? That's where that comes into play. You can do it along with others. So if you're doing a stakeholder engagement for your forest management plan, you can include pesticide aspects as well. Scale, intensity, risk, okay. Comparative risk assessments, comparing environmental and social risks for various options which have the least damage and greatest benefit. So we'll go back. Research requirement, identify and test alternatives to highly restricted and restricted HHPs. Research and justify use, justifying actions, timelines, targets, resources you plan to use. You're allowed to collaborate with research institutions and other certificate holders. A common nonconformity here has been a program to identify and test alternatives is either missing or inadequate. And this is where I talked about studies done 40 years ago may not be enough. Again, we're going to look at scale, intensity, and risk. How big is your program? How much land does it impact? How many people does it impact? How damaging are the chemicals that you use? Okay, so prohibited pesticides, no use except in emergencies or statutory authority order. And if you're using this Annex 3, it's a procedure and it must be followed. Third-party communication, inform processing plants and nursery suppliers of prohibited HHPs. This is a common nonconformity. I really argued against this one. I felt it was overreach by FSC in some ways because it's going outside of the forest management unit, but the international FSC group has really held firm on this. And in some countries, for example, Australia, their industry collaboratives communicated as a group with nurseries in general so that they avoided duplication of efforts. One country I know of, I think it was Scotland, did at their FSC office took that role. So if you have been going light on this to see how it might turn out, it is required. So you can expect that if your auditor hasn't covered it in the past, that it's going to come up throughout your cycle. If you purchase seedlings from outside nurseries, by this point, all of the major nurseries in the United States have been made aware, but you still have to provide evidence. So if you know someone else in the industry who's already communicated with the nursery, get that email from them, get the evidence that it's been done. And then you have to request a list of prohibited HHPs from third-party nurseries, another common nonconformity. Avoiding damage to environmental values and human health, risk prevention and mitigation priorities, damage, repair, and compensation. Repair damage according to its magnitude, fair compensation when reparation is not possible, and developing mechanisms for resolving grievances and compensation specifically for pesticide use, unless you roll your pesticide use dispute mechanisms under your other possibly existing ones. So these are just ones to be aware of and make sure that you understand. Monitoring, which is record keeping records of chemical pesticide usage. This is another one I think may come back. The international groups really wanted to see forestry keeping inventories of chemicals, and in forestry that's not typical. We keep track, we do spray records, a map of the area, how much was used on a site. We don't typically do really complex, involved inventory, but this may come back, just bringing that to your awareness. Common nonconformity, pesticide use is not reported or is reported inconsistently. Reporting by group members, contractors, non-affiliated parties responsible for management, let's say within easements. This is the responsibility of the certificate holder. The sooner everybody understands that, is aware of it, that we're all communicating it consistently and clearly, the better for everybody. In the pesticide policy document, there are two things I just wanted to point out that I actually found kind of useful. The table 2 on page 25, this lists the tasks at the management level and site level. And then there's just a flow chart. I thought it was a good graphic and visual. I took some time to break it down and it was helpful to me. Resources, national level ESRAs, there's a link on FSC US's site. And so just to do a recap of the risk assessments, identifying lowest risk, and it should inform your operational level planning. And have I mentioned the word documented? All right, so let's talk implementation. So evaluating a pesticide program or management system, every CB is going to have their own set of tools and recipe. If you are allowed to look at it or you get one in an audit report from your CB, follow any of those checklists and guides for auditors. You need to follow what your CB gives to you to use. So we're going to look at glyphosate, and I have a single slide here, and I'm going to actually go out of the presentation into this just real quick. Here is the pesticides policy. Here is the list of highly hazardous pesticides. And we're going to look in this real quick for glyphosate. Okay, so glyphosate, this is the 30-001. These are now listed in the DARs, so not many people are going in here. But the important part of this is it's listed as restricted. That doesn't mean you can't use it. You can. I'll get to that next one. If you go to glyphosate and that group, it lists actual CAS numbers. So EPA registration number is used in the United States to identify registered herbicides, pesticides. Internationally, it's the CAS number. So these would be considered highly hazardous. So if you have an auditor ask you about what formulation of glyphosate you're using, this is why they're asking. They want to see which active ingredient, because there are some glyphosates that are not HHP. And you are expected to know which. It's on the label and on safety data sheets. So here's an example of a safety data sheet. And Amy and Tom, I feel like I've forgotten some things. So if there's anything that comes to you that you heard us discuss in preparation, speak up, let me know, or remind me. So I'm just going to work through this. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger, make sure everyone can see it. This is a safety data sheet put out by Monsanto Company, the manufacturer for Roundup, which is a common brand. Roundup can be used on several different formulations. The date here in the upper right corner, effective date 5/13/2015, is significant because in 2012, across the world, there were globally harmonized safety data sheets were standardized into 16 sections. And across the world, as new chemicals are registered, they are expected to conform to this now. So manufacturers have been updating these over time. So you see here the EPA registration number, but in this safety data sheet, it also lists in part 3, composition information on ingredients, the international CAS number. So you can take that and search in the 30-001A list of hazardous chemicals and see if it's in there. It has a number of sections. So again, these are now standardized across SDSs. So an auditor might ask you, what will you do if this spills? And this is one of the places you might use. This is what will inform your mitigations. What are the risks? How do you protect your facilities? How do you protect your people? And so this is section 6 is an important one. Oops, I'm going backwards. Exposure control, personal protection. This is one I go to. Recommendations, eye, skin, respiratory section, or protection. So your auditor might ask, do you have an SDS for this chemical? You should. They might ask for the label. In the US, you are legally required to follow the label, which dictates amounts used in calibration of equipment and so on. So your auditor might ask, what sort of eye protection do you use? Are you required to use it? This might be listed in your mitigations. And for glyphosate, which is this is for, where is that? Skin protection. No special requirements be used as recommended. If repeated or prolonged contact, wear chemical resistant gloves. So this doesn't mean using a plastic bag from Walmart to protect your hands if you're doing repeated prolonged use. Glyphosate, it's the repeated exposure that's the risk and the danger here. And I mention it because it's such a common one in forestry. And I met a forester who had been doing it for a long time, over 15 years, and had lost all feeling in his hands. And he's pretty sure it was a result of glyphosate use over time without any protection. Just mentioning that. Other information, you know, this has incompatible materials, galvanized steel. So you don't want to put it in a steel drum or leftover chemicals in a steel drum. Ecological information, this is a newer one in the globally harmonized sections. And this gives you some more information on mitigation. So even if you don't have whatever the ESRA that your organization has developed and put forth, if you are looking at your labels, which are legally required to follow, and then you're looking at safety data sheets, you can get a lot of information from these. So if you have these and you're knowledgeable of what's in them, you can use them. So for example, this is slightly toxic to fish. Okay, come back to the slides. SDS 31, oh, we already did that. Open the national glyphosate. So this is the one that FSC US put together. Really nice that they did this. The risk assessment for glyphosate is pretty extensive. And they do a lot of nice things. Some surfactants, which influences droplet size, putting all these EPA registration numbers from the Forest Service data, but getting it all in here together. This is the template that is in the pesticide policy. So if you go to Annex 2 in the pesticide policy, go to the next one. Minimum list of hazards, exposure elements. This gets in the details. So you can go look into more detail on what exposure elements may be. You know, high conservation values is something that in the past, I think most organizations did not consider when using pesticides. It's expected to now. Local exposure variables. Shall complete a risk assessment to identify lowest risk options. The template that is given in this is a tool. It shall be completed to include the elements, but you do not have to use that big gigantic template. This is a really simplified template I've seen some organizations use for simple, low impact. And then here's the big gigantic one that we see that the national FSC used. Oops, that's not it. There I am. So the national FSC, I'm jumping around, so I've come back now to the national one that was developed by FSC US and is available on the FSC US website. Glyphosate is a restricted, highly hazardous pesticide. So this is something your auditor might check if you use this template. Is it accurate? Are you saying it's non-restricted when it actually is restricted? And that is something in the new 2007 version 4 we are expected to check. I did this, use this same one, so it has some notes that don't apply here. But in this particular example, the risk, why or why not it is a risk is in this column, the center column. And in the right-handed green column is the mitigations or protections defined at the national level. So if you use glyphosate, this is a freely available resource for you. That addresses some of the risks, for example, talking about droplet size, which you can influence by surfactants and nozzles and so on, which reduce drift. So just making sure you're all aware of that. FSC US also did one for sulfamaturin methyl, which is actually oust, which is not considered in HHP, which was very nice of them to do that because there's plenty of folks that use oust. So it's just another example I wanted to show you. If you haven't seen these, I encourage you to go check them and check them out and use them, and just always keeping in mind that you have to then apply these at the site level appropriately. And that is the certificate holders' responsibility. Typically we see a spray record, prescription that shows the map or extent or area where it was sprayed. That was just a very quick introduction to that. Okay. So another stop for questions here. Do we have questions? I'm looking at our question bar. Looks like we're good to go. Amy or Tom, anything that I've missed?
I was just going to emphasize one thing, Beth, and that the national level ESRAs, environmental social risk assessments, are there as a resource. Our understanding, well, we don't do the auditors, Beth and former and colleagues do that auditing. The national level ESRA is a starting point. It may be that it will be exactly what you need and you can apply it as it is. However, we expect that there will likely need to be some level of customizing, some level of adjustments that will be necessary to be applicable to the forest management unit where you are working. So just taking that national level and saying, okay, here's my ESRA, is likely not going to be accepted or allowed by your auditor. You'll need to show why the version that you're using is right for you, for the conditions of your management unit.
Also, real quick, I just wanted to pop in, Beth, if you extend your question box, we actually have gotten a few questions. I don't know if you would like to address those now or hold until the end, but I just want to make sure that you have visibility of those.
I don't see them. I don't know what I'm doing wrong.
Okay, if you want at the end, I can read them off to you and we can proceed that way.
Okay, and Amy, if you can see them, or you or Tom can see them, if there's any that could be addressed now, speak up. Otherwise, that's what we'll do. We'll wait to the end.
I actually cannot see them either. I was going to send a note to the organizers to note that.
Yeah, maybe you two, you can work on that as we go. Okay, I'm going to just plow ahead. So what are auditor questions to ask for certificate holders? What are some things you could expect no matter who your CB is? If you use chemicals, our primary biggest obligation is we have to make sure you're not using prohibited chemicals. We have to verify that. If you're using highly hazardous pesticides, do you have a documented IPM? In the past, we didn't have to have a documented IPM. You do. Do you have records of your chemical usage in implementing your IPM? Have you done a risk assessment? Do you know just even what the type of dangers there are with the chemicals you're using? Are they acute, chronic? Do they affect mammals, birds, or fish? Do they affect people? Are they carcinogenic, mutagenic? I mean, mutagenic's pretty nasty. I don't know many in the US that use that. And like I said, it blew my socks off to learn there are places in the world that they use these. Are they persistent in the soil? Do they have biomagnification? Many of my generation will remember lead used to be magnified up the chain, up into the eggs of eagles, right? Dioxins, heavy metals, again, these are the really nasty ones. If you're using something like that, you have a high obligation for safety. And if you do have an identified risk, what are the mitigations? And your auditors will ask questions to verify. The people who are out spraying, do they know what their protections are? They don't necessarily have to know there's an ESRA. They don't necessarily need to know that. But whatever the role and responsibility is of the staff person relative to pesticides, they need to know relative to that role. So if you're somebody who's managing a program, do you know the management aspects of it? If you're somebody who's got a backpack sprayer on your back or a sprayer on an ATV, do you know the safety gear you have to use? Do you know any protections that you have to honor? Do you have neighbors? And that's maybe at the planning level. So just verifying those aspects of protections. Tell me, show me, are you able to do that? Can you demonstrate safe storage, transport, and application? What is your evidence of that? Observing records, trainings, interviews, office records. Your auditors may ask, can I see your safety data sheet, your label, your storage facility, how you're transporting chemicals, how you're applying it. And if you're working with contractors, they may ask to speak to your contractors or see their records. If your contractor is keeping records, you need to get copies of those because you may be requested to provide them, or you need to make sure your contractor can have those records available. In the field, can I see your spray records? Can I see your map with all the required info? If it's a staff person, can I interview the person who sprayed it? Well, that's it. Okay, we are at the end, well ahead of time, so we do have time for questions for anybody who would like to do that. And maybe this would be a good time to read through some of those questions.
Okay, so the first question we have, it reads, in the past, the use of biological control agents required extra monitoring for several years following use. This discourages use of biological control agents. Is this changing now to encourage use over chemical pesticides?
To my knowledge, that's not changing. Amy or Tom? You two need to turn on your cameras and get in here.
No, the expectations around biological control agents are going to remain relatively similar. They are managed or handled in the standard as separate elements. So if there is a decision to address something through a biological control agent, there's expectations to consider the risk, there's expectations to document why this isn't going to become invasive or something of that nature. The use of biological pesticides, that's covered under criterion 10.7 and is considered to be part of the integrated pest management system. I do think that there is an opportunity to think about and consider biological control agents within the integrated pest management system. That would be one of your non-chemical, non-pesticide options that you would consider, and you would need to look at that related to potential risk, related to potential benefits, and related to the overall effectiveness. But there is still a separate section within the standard for biocontrol agents.
Okay, the next question reads, are you saying that the ESRA requirement could be covered by the safety data sheet and label?
There is still an expectation.
Go ahead, Amy.
Yeah, there's still an expectation to develop an environmental and social risk assessment. However, much of the information that will be needed to develop that environmental social risk assessment will come from those sources that are, easily accessible and available to you. And again, you don't have, like Beth said, you don't have to use the template that's in the pesticides policy. So your version of the ESRA could be something that's pulling that information in from those sources and then providing the required elements of an ESRA.
Yeah, and certainly for non-HHPs, OUST is a good example that if you're using that, the question as an auditor is, do you know the risk of that? Can you demonstrate that? Can you provide me evidence that you have considered that? And so you may have a simple sheet that says SDS section 16 or however you want to do it, but it needs to be, you need to be able to demonstrate it. And if I'm interviewing your people and they don't know the protections they should be using, or they're not following what I know is mitigation for that chemical, then I might just start digging down that inquiry and say, okay, I want to see what you wrote up for this. I want to see how you considered it. Demonstrate to me you considered it. So it gets to that scale, intensity, and risk. Amy, does that sound right? Okay. Next question.
Okay, the next question is for Amy. They're asking, would it be possible for FSC or FSC US to provide the HHP list in a spreadsheet rather than a PDF? This would make it a lot easier to import the list into technological tools to allow foresters to check the list for the proper category.
Yeah, definitely. We are right now looking at options for how FSC US can support certificate holders and stakeholders and others as we transition to the revised standard next year. We will not necessarily be able to do absolutely everything that ideas that come up. Initially and right away, we'll be working in a prioritized way. But that's definitely something that we can add to our list of resources that we will be looking at providing. And I'm happy to receive other suggestions from folks probably outside of the webinar today, unless they're directly pesticides.
Well, I have a question. Amy, aren't those listed already in the digital audit reporting template, the new one that all CBs are using? There's
Yeah, I haven't looked at the most recent version of the digital audit report, so you probably have got better insight into that one than I do. So it may be that your CB can already do this, and if that's the case, then we'll work with the CBs or FSC International to see if we can get access to that and make it available.
Yeah, okay. All right, next question.
Next question is, what are the expectations for revision of the HHP list?
HHP list is revised on a periodic basis. There was a brand new version which came out earlier this year, 2024. I believe that prior to that, it had been maybe 4 or 5 years. Beth, do you remember by chance?
Yeah, and I think one of the new things written is it's going to be revised every 5 years, in that it can be revised provisionally if a stakeholder brings evidence to FSC that a chemical not on the list should be on the list.
Yeah, I think that that's the key element there, is that, again, this is being done kind of in a risk, proactive risk way. If there is new evidence that comes that there is something that is highly risky, highly hazardous, which really should be addressed or considered differently by FSC certificate holders, then those changes might happen on a more rapid rate. But the very structured review and evaluation of all of the different chemical pesticides is intended to occur on that longer duration of approximately 5 years.
Okay, the next question asks, can you review the glyphosate ESRA and describe what one may add to the national ESRA to make it site-specific as you described as being necessary earlier in the presentation?
Was that for Beth or for me?
It
Sounds like it's me.
Tackle.
But, so I won't pull it up and open it up again, but Amy addressed this, and so I'll repeat what Amy said earlier, that the national is a guide. And so the example I pulled up of glyphosate, where it had the risks and the mitigations addressed. So a site level application of that example might be, so they had example with nozzles that you can impact drift. So one of the risks identified was drift in that national, and drift is when the chemical floats off site into unintended areas that may have negative environmental impact. So I'll use a stream running through the harvest area again as an example. That drift may go over the stream. So the national mitigation says you can adjust nozzles, I know you can also use surfactants, which is an addition you put into chemicals to make the droplets bigger, which means they fall quicker. So to adjust it on a site level basis, let's say you have a super windy day and you make a decision to use a different size nozzle that creates larger drops. So that's how you might adjust that to the site. Let's say you have a really large stream that has a rare, threatened, endangered fish that you're concerned about contaminating the water, then you may take even more additional steps. You may like double your buffer size, let's say. And that's how you would apply it at the site level, or how you might modify that national thing to the site level. Does that answer the question? That's the best I got.
Yeah, I'd almost look at it as kind of being 3 scales. We have a national level kind of guidance document, which considers all kinds of different potential conditions, considers all kinds of different potential situations. And then if you take that to make the, to develop the environmental social risk assessment for your management unit, you'd consider which of these things occur within the management unit. You know, what's the proximity of communities? Are there any rare, threatened, endangered species? Are there any high conservation values that need to be considered? Are there waterways that run through here? And there may be elements of the national level environmental social risk assessment that simply don't apply to that management unit, and therefore you would not expect to see that within the ESRA, which is developed for that chemical for that management unit. There may also be some unique aspects or conditions within that management unit that are not addressed in the national level environmental social risk assessment, and you would want to or need to, you'd be expected to consider those within your level. Okay, so then you've got the one that's sort of at that management unit level, and as Beth said, you've got to apply it at the site level. The standard requires site level operational plans or prescriptions, and those need to pull from the environmental social risk assessment and say, okay, our risk assessment says in these kinds of situations, we need to do this to mitigate risks. So does your operational level documentation, or does your site level documentation actually, you know, document that that's what you did and you considered the risks and the potential mitigation that you had identified in your environmental social risk assessment? Did you apply those? Did you document that you applied those on the ground in those site-specific considerations? So I'd kind of think of it at 3 different scales. You've got that national level, you've got the management unit scale for your environmental social risk assessment, and then you have the operational plans or prescriptions at that site level.
Awesome. Thank you.
And then we got one more question, and then we'll move on with our poll. The final question reads, how often do we need to notify nurseries of the HHP list? Is once during the 5-year recertification cycle enough?
I don't know that that is clear. I don't think it is. Amy, you're shaking your head.
Yeah, there's no specific expectation for the time, you know, the periodicity of that. In the pesticides policy, my inclination is that I would anticipate that once every certification cycle would likely be adequate, unless we get an interpretation or something else from FSC International which suggests otherwise. The one exception I would say is that if you are adding a new chemical to use, which was not part of your previous communication to nurseries, then I would suggest that that might be a time when it would make sense, you know, to be covered. It would make sense to communicate that.
With that, we're going to end it here. If there are additional questions that come in, we'll find a way to get back to you. We have a very quick survey. We're going to ask you to just click a couple buttons for us and give us some more information to FSC US.
So we've got a couple of other folks here as organizers for SES Global Services. I'm not sure if either of you want to say something in closing, or Tom and I can
I
close.
can offer a closing thought too. You know, earlier in my career, for the people who are online, I applied. I drove a 1,000-gallon tanker around Northern Virginia, applying fertilizer, pesticides, and fungicides all around Northern Virginia, in you know, heavily populated areas. And so it's no joke when we talk about these chemicals being dangerous. They're super dangerous when not applied properly or long-term exposure. So there's a lot of, although it can seem like it's a pain, there's a lot of wisdom in the FSC policy on around pesticides. And you know, look at these things that you're applying or you're thinking of applying, and just think about it. And that's what I think, that's what the policy is really at the heart of it. Think about it. Is this the best chemical? Is this the best rate? Can I use something different? Can I save my clients some money or time or effort or potential legal exposure? So just think about those things as you go through life and you're applying these chemicals. Yes, go ahead and use them. Follow our, you know, pesticides policy as certificate holders. And there's just a lot of wisdom in that policy. I hope you guys who attended, I hope everybody enjoyed the webinar as much as you can. I mean, it's a pretty dry subject, but I hope you enjoyed it as much as possible. And thank you for attending.
Thank you also again to SES Global Services for putting this on. We greatly appreciate it. I think Beth mentioned this early on, but it's being recorded and the recording's going to be available to folks. So if you know of somebody who might want to watch, who was unable to attend today, I think that information is going to become available, and then Tom, we can do our best to get it out via our communication forums as well. So thank you to everyone who attended. Thank you to SES Global Services. And you know, please let us know if there are additional resources that we can help to provide from FSC US to help streamline and simplify conformance with the coming standard. So thank you very much.